And our fourth main topic today gets submitted to us by Stephen Marchant, who writes, "Greetings, John and team. I had to shake my head and look again at what I was reading. But Kathleen Kennedy just said that part of what makes making Star Wars movies so hard is that unlike comic book movies, there's no source material to draw from. No books or comics. I couldn't believe it. Is she that clueless? Help me understand." Well, Stephen, let me help you. Help me help you. All right, so here's what's going on. For those of you who watched Dark Side, Light Side yesterday, we talked about this, but it bears bringing up again. Plus, I also want to get Robert's input on this. Kathleen Kennedy, who is a little bit of a lightning rod when it comes to the Star Wars community, even just for myself, I have a huge amount of respect for Kathleen Kennedy. Massive amount of respect. George Lucas, having worked with her for decades, handpicked her to run Star Wars and all that kind of stuff. And I have liked a lot of stuff, but I've also been very critical of her inability to do the most important part of her job, which is to properly identify, properly vet, and make sure she is 100% on the same page with the filmmakers who are going to be making the movies. And time again, we have seen she chose the wrong people only to have to announce to the world that they're directing the next Star Wars, and then they leave. And now these guys are going to write a new trilogy, and then they leave. And then, we got this person doing episode 9, and then they leave. This isn't over the course of 20 years. This is over the course of 4 films. They've had 5 major dramas. Maybe the most obvious big one of them was the whole Lord Miller fiasco, because she did not make sure she was on the same page with them before hiring them. Now, she's turned that around with Mandalorian. The Mandalorian is the greatest example of Kathleen Kennedy doing her job to absolute perfection. She heard hundreds of pitches, loved the Jon Favreau pitch, made sure her and Favreau were 100% on the same page, that he was going to take this in the direction they wanted to go overall. Then she paired him up with Dave Filoni, and then once all that was done, she said, "Now go forth and make your project." That is her doing her job perfectly. A little too little and a little too late, but at least she's doing it right at this point. She caused a stir yesterday because in an interview, in which she said a lot of very interesting things, by the way, but we're going to focus in on this one thing for now. We'll probably talk about some of the other things she mentioned moving forward. But one of the things that came out is this whole thing about books and comics. This was the comment she made. She said the following. When she was asked if, cracking episode 9 was a particularly tough nut to crack, she responded, "Every one of these movies is a particularly hard nut to crack. There's no source material. We don't have comic books. We don't have 800-page novels. We don't have anything other than passionate storytellers who get together and talk about what the next iteration might be. We go through a really normal development process that everybody else does. You start by talking to filmmakers who you think exhibit the sensibilities that you're looking for. And I would argue that the list is very small. People who really do have the sensibilities about these kind of movies, and the list is very small." Now, there's a lot of interesting things in here. But the thing that everybody seems to be zeroing in on mostly, because it is the big glaring flashing red light, is that the head of Lucasfilm just made a comment that there is no source material. We don't have comic books. We don't have novels. Now, Rob, as somebody who has been a lifelong Star Wars fan, I got to admit, sometimes I get some things with Star Wars wrong. I actually was under the impression that there were Star Wars books and that there was Star Wars comic books and video games and holiday specials. And I was under this mistaken impression that there were. Now, listen, I should point out here, Rob, that Christian Harloff on my show yesterday raised a very, very good point. And that point was this, that clearly Kathleen Kennedy knows there are Star Wars books and comics. Christian surmises, and he's probably right, that specifically what Kathleen Kennedy is referencing is that, hey, listen, there isn't a Star Wars episode 7, 8, and 9 book for us just to turn to and make Star Wars episode 8 from the book into the movie. That is 90% probably what she is specifically referring to. And I think when all of us take a little bit of a breath, after we recoil from the seemingly idiot thing to say, I think we can start to get a little bit of a picture of where she's coming from. But Rob, I want to propose that even assuming that we understand she was specifically talking about a specific set of movies and that there wasn't a specific set of books or comic books related to those specific movies, that's what she was referring to. Even if we accept that, and I do, I still want to propose there are 3 reasons why this was still a really, really dumb thing to say. A really dumb thing to say. And I'm going to start out by saying this. Number 1, it just looks bad. Look, when you are the head of a company, look, I run a tiny, insignificant, dumb as shit little YouTube channel.
Dumb as shit?
Well, I can only speak for the host. And I know that, and I've made mistakes, but I know that I have to be careful about the way I say things and how my public communication comes across. It's an important thing. And I've dropped the ball on it, absolutely. When you are the president of Lucasfilm, representing the most beloved franchise of films in cinematic history, you've got to be careful, particularly when you're doing a high-profile interview. You've got to be careful with your wording and what you're going to say. Now, this is maybe a little bit of a nitpick. It's not a big problem. But I would say, especially amongst a divided Star Wars fan base, Kathy, you gotta be real careful about how you're saying things. You gotta plan these things out and just be careful with your wording. So there's that. Number 2, it was an idiot thing to say because she just in one statement completely discredited the work that screenwriters do when they adapt material. I have spoken to a number of professional Hollywood screenwriters that insist to me, listen, writing adapted screenplays is harder than writing original screenplays. Because when you're writing an original screenplay, it's whatever you want. It's a blank page. It's a clean slate. You can create that world and those characters and whatever you want to do. And it's still monumentally difficult. But the screenwriters I have spoken to have said, but man, when you are trying to adapt something, where there's pre-existing expectations, where there's pre-existing actions and characters and events and circumstances that you have to work your creativity around to bring, and then you've got to adapt it and bring it to another medium, they say that's a particular challenge. By saying, well, you know, it would have been so much easier if we were adapted stories, I think the statement, again, is an insult and a slap in the face to the incredibly skilled, gifted writers who do the incredibly hard work of adapting screenplays. I don't think that was her intention. I don't think she at all intended to insult anybody. But again, it goes back to you got to be careful with what you're saying, because I personally know a couple of people who were directly insulted by her insinuation there. Again, I'm convinced she meant no insult by it, but still. But the third reason this was a dumb thing to say was that even though there are no Star Wars Episode 9 books, let us not pretend that there isn't a wealth, 90% bags of crap, admittedly. I'm sorry to everybody who loves the EU, 90% of it is absolute unreadable garbage. But 10% of it is actually really damn good. And within that, there is a vault full of old Star Wars stories and lore that you are free to go and maybe not take the entire story, but cherry pick from. Rebels went and got an EU character by the name of Grand Admiral Thrawn. They did not tell the Grand Admiral Thrawn story the way it was in the EU, but they cherry picked that character out and repurposed him and retrofitted him for their story purposes. Don't pretend like in the Star Wars lore, you don't have you don't have to go and take Darth Bane and then tell point for point the Darth Bane story, but you can go and take the Darth Bane character and retrofit him to your purposes in your movie. There's lots of material to draw from. So you're kind of insinuating that there wasn't, and there is. So number one, which is a bit of a nitpick, you just got to be more careful when you're the head of the company about how you communicate things. Number two, you got to be careful how you say these things, because I believe that what she said was a direct slap in the face to screenwriters who do the incredible difficult work of adapting screenplays. And number three, it was just incorrect to say that, because you do have a wealth of information that you can draw from if you so choose. So do I think her statements, Rob, were the end of the world kind of statements? Absolutely not. They're not end of the world statements. But it was a dumb thing to say. And I've said dumb things. You've said dumb things. Y'all have said dumb things. It does not the end of the world, but still we call ourselves out when we do it. And this was a dumb thing for Kathy Kennedy to say. Anyway, Rob, you saw these comments. You've had a chance to marinate on them for a while. What do you make of what she said?
Well, first of all, when Star Wars was created by George Lucas, he was drawing on Flash Gordon. He was drawing on Kurosawa movies like The Hidden Fortress. There was no Star Wars at all, but he was being influenced by all of these other things. I mean, there's a lot of film history. There's Shakespeare. There's the world that you can go and draw from, just like Lucas did originally. But what really bothers me, and I've been talking about this for years, the problem that Hollywood has is these big franchise properties, Star Wars, Star Trek, Alien, Predator. It has inspired novelists to write novels, comic book writers and artists to create comic books, and they've told some wonderful stories. I've often maintained the first Dark Horse comic of Alien versus Predator would have made an incredible film. But there is a prejudice in Hollywood. All of these things are considered marketing materials that are derivative of what the original things are. Movies and television are the pinnacle. If somebody writes a tie-in novel, that's considered fluff. It's considered marketing. Nobody gives it the time of day. And it's frustrating for me because as a longtime Star Trek fan, Star Trek has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, way more novels than there are Star Wars novels. And they've been published for a long time. And there's a lot of great stuff. All of them are discounted. When they hire, imagine, you're a screenwriter, you're making millions of dollars like J.J. Abrams was. Do you think J.J. Abrams is going to delve in to comic books or novels or video games for story ideas? That's not what they paid him for. They paid him for his genius to come in and write with Lawrence Kasdan, who co-wrote The Empire Strikes Back from Lee Brackett's script, or to come in and, wrote Raiders of the Lost Ark. These people are not going to be like, let's go consult like the Dark Horse run or the Marvel run of Star Wars comics. Let's put the Hoojibs in Star Wars. They're not going to do that, as much as I think the Hoojibs could be cool. And I think that's the problem, is that when people are working at the level that they're working at, they don't even think, they're like, I'm not going to go look into the EU novels. Who cares about the Knights of the Old Republic? So the Outrider appeared in Shadows of the Empire. We're not going to go put that in a movie. Well, the thing about these franchises is they really should, because these kernels of stories are thought about and ruminated over by the authors of these comics and these novels, and because they love the properties. That's why they're doing it in the first place. Nobody grows up to become, I want to be a Star Wars novelist. No, they become a Star Wars novelist because they loved Star Wars and they've thought about it for their whole lives. I mean, heck, man, I paged through Steve Sansweet's, I've got hardcover volumes of his Star Wars encyclopedia, and I just, for fun, page through, and I think, wouldn't it be cool if they told the story about blah, blah, blah? I mean, that's why the Clone Wars show, look at the Clone Wars. The Clone Wars, as it went along, has some great Star Wars stories, a great increasing the lore. I mean, if you're going to work on Star Wars, it's about time you become knowledgeable about all this stuff. The fan base is, and they're wondering, this was a great story. Like you said, a lot of it isn't.
Yeah, but remember, though, Clone Wars is canon. Clone Wars is not
right. No,
EU.
I know,
Yeah.
But I'm sure the filmmakers, it's not like somebody's going back there and tracking. The first thing somebody should do when they're hired, if they don't know what to write, I mean, with Star Wars, it's like, oh my God, you have a smorgasbord of ideas that you can take from. But you know what? Even in Rebels, they did not credit Timothy Zahn for creating Grand Admiral Thrawn. It's not like they went back and gave him some cheddar, like, hey man, because Lucasfilm owns it.
But he did write 3 more novels.
He did write 3, and he's got more coming out.
Yeah.
And even Sideshow made a Thrawn, not a hot toy, but a figure. And it's pretty cool. And it's worked before, and they just don't think about it. Kathleen Kennedy's like, oh yes, let me read my EU paperbacks that I've read all of. But she doesn't know.
But to be fair, do you know where Kathleen Kennedy got that from? George Lucas. who
Right.
completely dismissed all of the EU.
Of course.
Dave Filoni, let's keep that in mind too.
Yes.
Dave Filoni famously tells the story about how like George counts none of the EU.
Right.
He had no respect for the EU whatsoever. So let's not. So if you want to point a finger at Kathleen Kennedy for saying, and I've done this too, and for the fact that she has no respect for the EU or stuff like that, you know where she got it from? She got it from George.
And by the way, I don't think George Lucas should be pilloried for that. Star Wars is his,
right?
And what's in his mind or whatever is not. When fans take over something, and I think a lot of people like George Lucas that weren't ensconced in fandom growing up, a lot of people they don't understand. I work with William Shatner, and I can tell you, even now, he's met with fans, he goes to conventions. In his mind, he still doesn't understand or doesn't quite grasp why have people spent so many hours, so many years and decades of their lives ruminating over Star Trek episodes. He's like, I ride horses, I'm a sportsman, I travel the world. He doesn't, and a lot of people, George Lucas doesn't either. He's like, this is a thing I do as a job, but I don't know why you would spend time after you see the movie and you've watched it. Why would you want to then go home and recreate or write novels about all these things? I mean, that's crazy talk.
So question here is, guys, again, I don't think this is a make or break thing. I don't think this is the end of the world. I just thought it was a dumb thing to say. And I don't know if it's a reflection of a larger issue. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I'm not sure. But question is, guys, how do you guys feel about all that? Jump down to the comment section below and leave me your thoughts.